standing here as a shliach. The Rav Heber very much wanted to be here. Unfortunately, he is home sick with corona, so was not able to make it. And he asked me just to a few words of introduction. Not that the Rav Shiva needs an introduction, but Rav Hershel Shachter Shlita is the Rosh Kol and Rosh Yeshiva at the Rav Yitzchak Chanan Kollel in Yeshiva University. He has been fascinating Talmidim with his Torah for well over 50 years. He is one of the great Talmidei Chacham and Poskim in our generation. In the Rav's own words, Rav Shachter sees himself as one who is giving over the Masorah that he received from great Gedolim and the Svarim which he is Baki. We thank him for coming, and we are honored to have him here with us in KSY.
Thank you very much. First, I have to apologize for coming so late and keeping everybody waiting. It's really my fault, so I apologize. Inyanei Eretz Yisrael began from day number one when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world. The Gemara says, Eretz Yisrael Mikol Ha'arotzos and Yerushalayim Yisrael. What does that mean? It's based on the Psukim that when the brothers of Yosef were shuttling back and forth between Eretz Canaan and Eretz Mitzrayim, so when they went down to Eretz Mitzrayim, it says, Vayerdu Acha Yosef Asora. When they went back to Eretz Yisrael, it says, Vayalu. So you see that's called Aliyah, and that's called Yerida. Then the Gemara establishes that Yerushalayim is Gevoim, we call Eretz Yisrael, based on the pasuk in this week's Sedron, in Parsha Shoftim, that it says, when there'll be Ki Yipalamim Chadov al HaMishpat, Bin Dam Ledam, Bin Din Ledin, Dibri Rivas Bisharecha. If you have a machlokes, so Gesundheit, have a machlokes. In one community they follow one din, they follow their rabbi. In the other community they follow the other rabbi. In Europe, they had big Talmidei Chachamim. In each village they followed the local Orthodox rabbi. But if the machlokes is causing, you don't have to bring every issue to the Beis Nagadol. In recent years, anywhere in the world there would be a shayla, so they would call up Rabbi Yashiv. Everybody in the world is mechuyev to follow Rabbi Yashiv. Not mechuyev. Other people are entitled to their opinion also. But if it's causing friction, families are fighting about it, causes friction, then you have to present it to the Beis Nagadol. It says, so the Gemara establishes that Yerushalayim is Gevoya, we call Eretz Yisrael. So the problem is that we know it's not true. Eretz Yisrael is not the highest elevation above sea level. The Swiss Alps is much higher. And Yerushalayim is not the highest location in Eretz Yisrael either. The Gemara says that David HaMelech was planning to build a Beis HaMikdash in Ein Hittim because that's the highest elevation above sea level. And then the Navi told him, no, the din is L'shichnu Sidushu. In Parshas Re'eh it says L'shichnu Sidushu. So the Sifrei says, Rosh Al Pi Navi, that first the Rabbanim have to try to figure out where is the location to build the Beis HaMikdash, and after they figure it out, then they have to consult the Navi. So David HaMelech made a whole cheshbon, it should be Ein Hittim, that's the highest elevation. And then they told him no. The Navi told him no, you should have it a little lower. So the Tanoim knew, the Gemara knew that Yerushalayim is not the highest elevation. So what do they mean when they say Yerushalayim Gevoyim Mikol Eretz Yisrael? So the Baal HaMor addresses this in Rosh Hashanah and Daf Chof and Beis. There's a difficult passage in the Gemara there. Rashi and Tosfos have a very difficult interpretation in the Gemara. Rashi and Tosfos interpret the Gemara had a Havamina that the days should change at midnight. By the Goyim, that's the difference between Sunday and Monday changes at midnight. But the Gemara has a Havamina that by us, listen to the radio, they always say the holiday of the high holidays ever begins from sundown to sundown. Everybody knows that. It's a strange Gemara. So the Baal HaMor has a totally different shot. And all the other Rishonim, they all say like the Baal HaMor. The Chazon Ish wrote a whole essay about this. That the Gemara is alluding, that whole sugya is alluding to the issue of the international date line. The problem is that as you go east, when you go from New York to Eretz Yisrael, so Shabbos is 7 hours earlier. If you keep on going east, so Shabbos keeps on getting earlier. And when you go west from New York, I live in New York, so when you go west from New York, when you go to California, so Shabbos is 3 hours later. If you keep on going Further to the west, Shabbos is going to be an hour later, an hour later, an hour later. So the people that are going east are going to bump into the people going west. So by them it's going to be the earliest place in the world that is going to be Shabbos, and those who are going to the west, the same location is going to be the latest place in the world. So you have to have some line where you say, Ad Kan V'lo Yoser. Where's the international date line? So the Chazon Ish points out the 7 Rishonim, the Kuzari, has also what the Baal HaMor says, and he quotes another, altogether 7 Rishonim. They all learn Pshat in the Gemara, that the Gemara is discussing the topic of the date line. So the Gemara is assuming that the earth is a globe, and whenever you have a globe, it's not flat, and whenever you have a globe, so there are 2 hemispheres. You can divide you can cut a ball in half. So you can divide the 2 hemispheres, upper hemisphere, lower hemisphere, based on the equator. Or you can say Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere. Eastern Hemisphere is the communists, Russia. Western Hemisphere is America. So how are you supposed to divide the hemispheres? So the Gemara says when the Rebbeinu Shalom created the world, and he started the earth spinning on its axis, and everything began Vayera Vahivoke Yom Echad, Vayera Vahivoke Yom Sheni. So what was on top? What was on top? And the Mela, what was the first? If you have 2 hemispheres, so the upper hemisphere will begin 6 hours to the east of whatever on top. Each hemisphere will have 12 hours. So I would have thought the North Pole was on the top. So the Gemara said not the North Pole, not the South Pole. It was Yerushalayim and Eretz Yisrael were on top. So the end of that hemisphere will be 6 hours to the east of Yerushalayim, 6 hours to the west of Yerushalayim. So the the globe turns on its axis. 6 hours to the east of Yerushalayim is the first place. Vayera Vahivoke. So what is the first place? What is 6 hours to the east of Yerushalayim? So that's what the Chazon Ish says. That's the Haskama of all the Rishonim who speak about the topic. According to Rashi and Tosafos, there's no Gemara that talks about the topic of the date line. But according to these 7 Rishonim, here's the whole sugya in Rosh Hashanah Daf Chaf Amud Beis. So it's 6 hours to the east of Yerushalayim. So that cuts through Australia. 2/3 of Australia is to the east of the date line. 1/3 is to the west of the date line. And it cuts through Siberia, it cuts from Manchuria, the southeastern section of Russia. So that's a question. Do you have, let's say, half of Australia, 2/3 of Australia to the east of the date line, 1/3 to the west. So you say on one side of the street it's Friday, and the other side of the street is Shabbos. Does that make sense? You divide one landmass into 2. And if so, most of the Rishonim, the 7 Rishonim, don't talk about that. I think one or two of them, talk about it. So they say that it doesn't make sense. So the Chazon Ish adopts that it does make sense. Then the question is, so how do you decide? Do you go Basar Roiv? Australia, 2/3 of Australia is to the east of the date line. So the Miyut should be, I would have thought, the Miyut should be Niger after the Roiv. So the Chazon Ish quotes these Rishonim who say this, that it doesn't make sense to have one side of the street should be Erev Shabbos, one side of the street is Shabbos. So they say that the more important hemisphere is the one that has Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim, where all of civilization began. The rest, America was inhabited later, they assume. There were no people in America in the beginning. Adam Rishon was in Gan Eden somewhere in that hemisphere. So this is from day number 1, the way the Chazon Ish explains the Rishonim, Baal HaMor says it, and these 7 Rishonim say. From day number 1, when the Rebbeinu Shalom created the world, Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim had a significance. Eretz Yisrael Gevay Mekol HaRotzos and Yerushalayim Gevay Mekol Eretz Yisrael. It does mean highest elevation above sea level. It means when the Rebbeinu Shalom created the world, what was on top? Number 2, Eretz Yisrael Al Pi Din belongs to the Jewish people. We own Didi Mominus wise. We own Eretz HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avraham Avinu, Kum Hisalach Baras L'Orka L'Rachba Ki L'Choy Tineno. So the Gemara in Perek Yesh Nechlin speaks about the story of Bnei Tzlopchad. What was their shaila? What was the shaila that they asked? So the simple pshat in the shaila was, if a man dies and he has no sons, whether the daughters get Yerusha or not. So the answer was yes, the daughters get Yerusha. So the Gemara quotes one Tana who says that the Bnei Tzlofchad knew and Moshe Rabbeinu knew, that was Yadua. The Shaila was a different one based on the Mishnah. The Mishnah there in Yesh Nechlan says Tzlofchad ben Chayfer was the firstborn. He was the Bchor to his father. So the Bchor is entitled to Pishnai. But the Pasuk says in KSY, I think in this week's Sedrum, as Abchor ben Asturei Yakel Asal Pishnai B'chol Asher Yimotze Lo. So the word Yimotze Lo means only b'muchzak, not b'ro'ui. Let's say the father bought a ticket, a lottery ticket, and the lottery drawing is after the father died. So at the moment that the father died, he didn't yet have this asset. He bought the winning ticket, the sweepstakes ticket. He bought a ticket for the Irish sweepstakes, and the drawing took place after the father died. So the father never had that asset. So the Bchor only gets Pishnayim B'chol She'imatzei Lo B'muchzak and not B'ro'ui. So the Gemara has one Tana says that was the suffix of Bnei Tzlofchad. The Mishnah says in Yesh Nechlan that Bnei Tzlofchad were entitled because their father was the Bchor. Tzlofchad ben Chayfer was the Bchor, so he was entitled to Pishnayim. So what did Chayfer have already? So he had Bizas Mitzrayim, all the Yotzim Mitzrayim, the Ader Pesach of Hakrovas Korban Pesach Mitzrayim. Everybody had a hayrasha to knock on the next neighbor's doors and to ask for matanas. So he had matanas. Then there was Bizas Hayam. When the Mitzrayim Mesim, the bodies were swept up on after Kriyas Yamsuf, so the Mitzrayim drowned. So they took some Bizas Hayam at that time. Maybe he had a sukkah that he slept with him. He had some underwear, some pajamas, whatever. He had a suitcase with a little junk. What could he possibly have? The Shaila was, what about the real estate in Eretz Yisrael? When HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avraham Avinu, Kum hisalach baras lo'ka l'orach b'kilecha etenenu. Did HaKadosh Baruch Hu mean that's a promise that's going to be fulfilled in the distant future when Yeshua ben Nun will conquer the land? Then it'll belong to the Jewish people. Or no, maybe Yilucha etenenu means by you walking around the borders, that will constitute a kinyan chazakah. The Rebbeinu Shalom is the balabas over the whole world, and he has the right, the first Rashi and Chumash, has the right to give it to whomever he wants. So he told Avraham Avinu, walk around the borders, and that will constitute a kinyan chazak. So the Mishnah says in Cheskes Habatim, the word chazak means a different thing there. Pri Megadim writes in his Psicha Kalelis, word chazak in halacha has 6 different meanings, totally unrelated to each other. So karkas nikdas b'chazaka, that's a Mishnah in Cheskes Habatim. What constitutes a chazaka to be kind of karka? So the Mishnah is noal goder u'poretz. Noal means you lock the door. Goda means you put up a fence. Poretz means you break down the fence. Walking around the borders does not constitute a kinyan chazaka. So the Gemara has this was the shaila. This was the shaila Bnei Tzlofchad were asking. When Avraham Avinu walked around the borders, was that a hayrah shah? Was that a hayrah that constitutes a kinyan chazaka? And Eretz already belonged to Avraham Avinu. When Avraham Avinu passed away, went to Yitzchak, Yerusha. Yitzchak passed away, went to Yankov. Yankov passed away, went to the Shvatim. So it already belonged to Chayfer. So Chayfer, it's muchzak, it wasn't raw. It's not that it was a promise that's going to be fulfilled in the distant future when Yeshua ben Nun will conquer the land. Avraham Avinu was kind of ready. So one Tana is of the opinion, the Gemara there in Yesh Nechlan quotes, one Tana is of the opinion that it constitutes a chazaka bizman hazeh. If I sell you a pardes and I tell you walk around the borders and you'll acquire ownership of it, so one Tana holds that constitutes a chazaka bizman hazeh also. We don't accept that Tana's opinion. So the Gemara came to the Maskan over here, but as a hayrasha, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avraham Avinu, ki lucha etenenu, you will acquire ownership immediately. That's how we pass it. Eretz belonged to Avraham Avinu, and it was muchzak and wasn't ro'ui. So that's why the Mishnah says in Yesh Nechlan that Tzlofchad was entitled to a double portion. Where did the Tana get this in the pasuk? The simple reading of the pasuk was that they were asking, but Tzlofchad were asking, if there are no sons, then the daughters get Yerusha. How did they come up with such a pshat? It was a shayla by roya muchzak. So the Mefarshim HaChumash suggests, because when HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered Moshe Rabbeinu says, he'll ask the Rebbeinu Shalom. Then the Rebbeinu Shalom answers him, no son, Why does it say noson titein in the Kefa Loshen? So the Mefarshim Chumash on the page, so they say, maybe it's Torah Chaim HaKodesh, I don't remember. So someone says on the page in the Chumash, noson titein means they were entitled to a double portion because it was muchzik and wasn't roi. Usually there's a din of Kibush Muhammad. It's a sugya that people have learned Af Yomi. In the Lameds, in Gittin, there's a whole sugya that Kehillas Shivtei is an international din based on Psukim in Tanakh. If the Jews conquer territory from the Nochim, or the Nochim take over territory from the Jews, or the Nochim take over, the Nochim have a war, the Gemara couldn't visualize the Jews having a Muhammad against the Jews. So that they don't talk about. They talk about the Jews won the war against the Goyim, or the Goyim won the war against the Jews, or the Goyim run a war against another group of Goyim. So whoever wins the war, even though they had no right to wage the war in the first place, it was begezel. Russia started a war with Ukraine. We assume it was not legal. It was illegitimate. But if they're going to win the war, then be kind of everything in Ukraine. The Bekarka with the Metalpalim, with the people will be niknez avodim. That's Gemara learns out from Psukim that there's such an international din of Kibush Muhammad. So one may argue the point and say that since the Roman army waged war against the Jewish people and they took over the whole Eretz Yisrael, or let's say the Babylonian time of Churban Bais Rishon, Babylonian army waged war against the Bnei Yisrael, and the Jewish people lost the war and they took over the whole country. So one can perhaps say that we lost our ownership. Avraham Avinu acquired ownership of Eretz Yisrael by walking around the borders. That constituted the Kinyan Chazakah. But then when the Babylonians took it away from the Jewish people, so we lost the ownership of Eretz Yisrael. So that's what the opening Rashi on Chumash says. The Rebbeinu Shalom told us, what do you need the whole Chumash Bereishah? The Torah should begin from Acharish Zalachem, the first mitzvah that was given to Klal Yisrael as a nation. So Rashi quotes in the Medrash, Rabbi Yitzchok, Kach Ma'asav Higel Amai, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the Balabas over the whole world, and he gave Eretz Yisrael to the Jewish people, and it belongs to us all the time. So the Pashup Pshat in Rashi is, Rashi is quoting a Medrash, Pashup Pshat is that we never lost our ownership of Eretz Yisrael. During the 7 years of Golus Bavel, Eretz Yisrael still belonged to the Jewish people, and after the Romans conquered Eretz Yisrael, we never lost our ownership of Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Zalman Meltzer has a sefer on the Rambam, the Emin Ho'azel. The Rambam writes that Kedusha Rishayna of Eretz Yisrael, we'll get to it soon. Kedusha Rishayna was accomplished by Kibush V'chiluk. After Yeshua ben Nun conquered Eretz Yisrael, it took 7 years to conquer all of Eretz Yisrael. That's a pasuk. And then it took another 7 years to divide it. Chalukah l'shvatim, chalukah l'mishpachas, and chalukah l'yichidim. The Gemara says in the end of Erchen, that's not a pasuk anyway, but that's an oral tradition, Gemara. It's an oral tradition. So the Gemara said the first 14 years in Eretz Yisrael, there wasn't yet Kedushas Haaretz. We needed the Gemar HaKibush, and the Chalukah was the Gemar HaKibush. So the first Shemitah was the 21st year after they crossed over the Yarden. The first Yovel was the 54th year, because the first 14 years didn't count. And they weren't Chayv and Shumas HaMaises till year number 15. That was the beginning of Kedushas Haaretz. So the Rambam says the Mekadosh of Eretz Yisrael the first time around, that's called Kedusha Rishayna, was Kibush V'chiluk. Then the second time around, when Ezra came back with the Shavei Hagolah, with the Shivas Sion, there was no Kibush. They were under Malchi Paras and Madai. They didn't have their own independent Jewish government till centuries later, till the days of the Chashmonai. That was towards the end of the Baisheni period. So the Rambam says, was in the Mekadosh of Eretz Yisrael the second time around? So the Rambam says, Chazakah. So what does that word mean? Chazakah is very unclear. So Rabbi Zalman in his sefer on the Rambam understood it means the Kinyan Chazakah, that the Jewish people lost their ownership of Eretz Yisrael because of Kibush, the international din of Kibush Muhammad. The Babylonians took Eretz Yisrael away from the Jewish people, so we lost the ownership of Eretz Yisrael. So then the Jews had to make a Kinyan Chazakah to reacquire ownership of Eretz Yisrael. So many years ago, after the Sinai campaign, most of you probably weren't even born, Sinai campaign. So Rabbi Gorin was the chief chaplain in the army, and he visited America afterwards. He was very charismatic speaker, speaking all over the place, extremely entertaining. So he requested to give a shiur in Rabbi Soloveitchik's class. That was in Rabbi Soloveitchik's class then. So he gave a whole shiur, and he was assuming like Rabbi Zalman Meltzer. He didn't say that he got it from the Eben Ozel, but that's what he thought. He was assuming that when the Rambam says Chazaka, it means the Kinyan Chazaka, that the Jewish people lost their ownership of Eretz Yisrael during the 70 years of Golus Baba. Rabbi Soloveitchik was sitting in and listening to the shiur that he gave, and he disagreed with him in the middle of the shiur. Rabbi Gorin said, no, this is the pshat. Now remember, he was very dramatic. He had in his pocket, a small edition of the Talmud Yerushalmi. And he was a very charismatic speaker. So he said, Asher Misha Ba'alakan Talmud B'Yoda, he says in Hebrew, he has with him a Talmud Yerushalmi. He came from Yerushalayim, he has with him a Talmud Yerushalmi. Everybody burst into laughter. And he's reading the passage in the Yerushalmi, and he presented his whole shiur. Rabbi Soloveitchik said, with all due respect, you're not allowed to say that. That's not correct. Jews never lost the ownership of Eretz Yisrael. And he kept on insisting. So the next day, when Rabbi Gorin was not there, Rabbi Soloveitchik said he wants the students to know that he absolutely disagrees. It's not true. The Jewish people never lost the ownership of Eretz Yisrael. And that's what the Chazon Ish writes also in his Sefer on Shvius. He writes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Avraham Avinu, make a kinyan chazaka. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes a shvuah, that is going to, a bris and a shvuah, that is going to give Eretz Yisrael to the descendants of Avraham Avinu. That he makes a bris and a shvuah with Yitzchak, and a bris and a shvuah with Yaakov. So what do you need a bris and a shvuah? He already gave Eretz Yisrael to Avraham Avinu. What do you need a bris and a shvuah? So the Ramban Chumash has in a few places, a bris and a shvuah means al kol panim. Under all circumstances, it's absolutely going to be like this. What do you mean absolutely? That even though there is an international dinner, Kibbush Muhammad, there's one thing in the world that's not subject to Kibbush Muhammad. Eretz Yisrael belongs to the Jewish people forever. Rabbi Soloveitchik used to speak at the Mizrahi lectures. When he was always speaking, every year he would speak from the Mizrahi at the convention. So he would always say, publicly, we do not owe a debt of gratitude to the British for giving us Eretz Yisrael. Never belonged to the British in the first place. Always belonged to the Jewish people. The Jewish people never lost their kinyan of Eretz Yisrael. So that's the kinyan that was made by Avraham Avinu. Then there's a separate topic, separate aspect of Kedushas Haaretz. Eretz Yisrael is centrally located. It's the middle of the upper hemisphere, and that's relevant for the international dateline. Then ownership of Eretz Yisrael belongs to the Jewish people from the days of Avraham Avinu, and we never lost our ownership. Then Kedushas Haaretz says Kedusha Rishayna and Kedusha Shniya. So the Kedusha Rishayna, Tosfos in Yevamos quotes the Rabbeinu Hananel. It says that Kedusha Rishayna was chal in the days of Avraham Avinu. So Tosfos says, Tosfos usually has high respect for Rabbeinu Hananel, called Dvar Divrei Kabbalah. He has traditions from the God. Tosfos says over here, it's absolutely not acceptable. Kedusha Rishayna was Aidei Yoshua ben Nun, not Aidei Avraham Avinu. Kedusha Rishayna was chal Aidei Kibush. Rav Soloveitchik once gave a beautiful Yortzeit Drasha where he started off with the assumption of Rab Chaim Volozhin, Nefesh Chaim quotes the Gemara Megillah divides all of the religious articles that you can buy in a Judaic store into two categories. You have Tashmishi Mitzvah and Tashmishi Kedusha. So you have a sukkah and an esrog and a shofar and a talis, a hooked to the mitzvahs is ma mitzvahs. But after the sukkah is over, so the sukkah is no longer hooked to the mitzvahs, and the esrog is no longer hooked to the mitzvahs. You throw it in the garbage. If you have an old talis, and my wife bought me a new talis, so what am I going to do with the old talis? I want to donate the talis to the shul. So I give it to the Gabba. The Gabba says he doesn't want it. It's dirty, and it's not nice, it's all stained. He doesn't want it. I want to give it to a poor man. Nobody wants it. So what do you do with it? It's a talis lachas ma'amitzvos. Nobody wants to use it. So the din is you throw it in the garbage. You don't have to put it in the shem. In Shulchan Aruch they quote the Rashba, who quotes Rishayim. You shouldn't throw it in the garbage with the dirty diapers. You shouldn't throw it in there with the chicken bones or with the fish bones. You should put it in a separate bag and then throw it in the garbage. But basically it's a tashmisha mitzvah. Tashmisha mitzvah only hooked to the mitzvahs and bizman mitzvahs. But if you have Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzah, even if it's possible to the extent that it's not shaykh to fix it, not shaykh to correct it, so it's lachas man mitzvah already, so the din is you have to put it in Shemus. So how did the Tanoim determine what belongs to the category of Tashmisha Mitzvah, what belongs to the category of Tashmisha Kedusha? So Rab Chaim Volozhin says, in order to be considered Tashmisha Kedusha, you have to have Divrei Torah. To the extent you have psukim written, then it has the status of Tashmisha Kedusha. So we know Mezuzah has Shema B'Hayom Shemaya, so it has the lowest level of Kedusha. If you have Tefillin Shal Yad, so in addition to Shema B'Hayom Shema, you have Kadesh V'Yokev Yacha. So Tefillin has more Kedusha than Mezuzah. Tefillin Shal Rosh has 2 shins, 1 shin, 2 shins. We have 2 shins on the outside. The Gemara talks about 1 shin. So you have 1 letter more, because Tefillin Shal Rosh has a slightly higher level of Kedusha than Tefillin Shal Yad. The Gemara says, Nafkemina la'aloche, then Malam HaKodesh v'lo meridni. You're permitted to convert a Shal Yad into a Shal Rosh. That's Malam HaKodesh, but you're not permitted to convert a Shal Rosh into a Shal Yad. That'll be a violation of Marid. Then there's a Rambam, Rav Soloveitchik pointed out, pretty clear in the Rambam, if they'll find author's copy of the Luchas. The Luchas Shnias used to be Indiana Jones, I think he was called. He said he knows where the Luchas are, and he spoke to the Mukabalim, probably not alive anymore. Is he? I don't know. So he says he knows where the Luchas, he got permission from the Mukabalim to reveal it, where the Luchas are. But when we'll find the Luchas, so what has more Kedusha? A Sefer Torah that was written by a Sefer, Shnas Tavshin Pei Gimel, or the Luchas, which is the Rebbeinu Shalom's Ksav Yad Kotshai, of the Rebbeinu Shalom. So the Rambam is Kemat Beferish. The Sefer Torah has more Kedusha, because it has Aseres Hadibas plus more. To the extent that you have psukim written, to that extent you have Kedusha. So that's where Rav Soloveitchik wanted to figure out all the rest of the things that have Kedusha. So he said, why does a Jewish person have Kedushas Yisrael? Where do you have Divrei Torah? So he said, the Malach teaches every baby Kol HaTorah Kula. That's the Gemara in Nida. The Tanya starts with that. The first page in the Tanya starts with that. I got it then. Malach teaches the baby. So he said, even a Jewish person who never opened the Sefer in his life, he's not observant, he doesn't know anything about the Torah. We assume the Malach taught him Kol HaTorah Kula. You know, the Malach slaps him on the face and he forgets everything. It doesn't wipe off everything. Otherwise, why did he engage in such an act of futility to teach him Kol HaTorah Kula? They'll make him forget everything. The answer is something remains. So that's the Mokar of the Kedushas Yisrael. The Rav Soloveitchik said, what's the Mokar of the Kedushas Beis HaMikdash? So he said, you have the Luchas and the Beis HaMikdash. What do you do at the end of the Beis Rishon period? Yoshua Melech was going to the Luchas, but he put it in the basement, in the chamber in the basement. And the Rambam writes that that chamber in the basement was part of the original Megillah Biksav that the Navi gave to David HaMelech. David HaMelech gave it to Shlomo HaMelech. There was a blueprint how you have to build a Beis HaMikdash. That chamber in the basement. When it comes time, you have to put the Aron with the Luchas in the chamber. That was part of the original plan. So the Beis HaMikdash had Kedusha because the Aron was there. Where were the Luchas and Baisheni? So the Gemara Yuma has different opinions in the Tanoim. So in the Rambam and the Mishnah Torah takes a stand on a historical machlokes, very strange. In the Mishnah Torah usually only takes a stand on halachas. So the Rav Soloveitchik thought it would appear from the Rambam that he understood that this is not just an issue of history, this is an issue of halacha also. Is it conceivable that you can have a Beis HaMikdash, have Kedusha Beis HaMikdash, without having luchas there? And the Rambam assumes no. The Rambam assumes like that Tana, that the luchas were there, the whole Baisheni. You have to consult Indiana Jones, was out there. But that's what the Rambam assumes, that the luchas were there in the basement, the same location where Yoshua Melech left them at the end of the Beis Rishon period. That's where the luchas were, the whole Baisheni. Without that, the Rambam seems to assume that it wouldn't have a Kedushas Beis HaMikdash. The same thing, what is the source of Kedushas Beis HaKnesses? So the Rambam seems pretty clearly, in Hilchas Tefillah, the Rambam quotes all the dinim of Kedushas Beis HaKnesses. So it seems pretty clear from the Rambam that there are some Orthodox Jews who have office space in Manhattan, and they designate one room for davening for Mincha Ma'ariv. But when it's a time of Sibur and Yilen Kriyas HaTorah, then they'll go to a shul. They don't have a Sefer Torah there. For the Rambam would appear that if you have a Beis HaKnesses that doesn't have a Sefer Torah. It doesn't have a Kedushas Beis HaKnesses. Just like it's a Migdash Miyat, just like the Beis HaMikdash has to have the Lucha, so the Beis HaKnesses has to have a Sefer Torah. There's such a taste is also in Nazir. There's a little places in Nazir that has apropos to nothing on the daf in Nazir. I don't know what it's doing there. So Taisus says the Kedushas Beis HaKnesses emanates from the fact that there's a Sefer Torah, Torah Shebichsav, and Kedushas Beis HaMedrash emanates from the fact that they're learning Torah Shebal Peh. It's interesting. The Gemara in the end of Megillah has a machlekes of Yechon Rabbi Shua ben Levi, which has a higher level of Kedusha. The Gemara assumes for sure it's not the same level of Kedusha, Beis HaKnesses or Beis HaMedrash. So the Gemara seems to present it the way it says in our Gemara, a Beis HaKnesses is miyuchad for davening, Beis HaMedrash is miyuchad for learning. Which is more important? Learning or davening. That's the simple reading of the Gemara in Megillah. So Tosfos has a different twist, that the Beis HaMedrash, the Kedusha emanates from the fact that they're learning Torah Shebal Peh. The Beis HaKnesses, the Kedusha emanates from the Sefer Torah, like same as it appears in the Rambam. And it would appear from Tosfos that that's the Nukudas HaMachlekes of Rabbi Yechon and Rabbi Shua ben Levi, which is a higher level. Torah Shebichsav, Torah Shebal Peh. In the Maskana of the Gemara, Torah Shebal Peh. Torah Shebal Peh is a higher level than Torah Shebichsav. Interesting. So Rav Soloveitchik said, Abchaim Aloshan is Yisoid, that in order that something should have Kedusha, it has to have Psukim. To the extent that it has the Torah written, to that extent it has Kedusha. So Kedushas Yisrael, and Kedushas Beis HaMikdash, and Kedushas Beis HaKnesses, and Kedushas Beis HaMedrash, everything is based on Torah. So he said, where's Kedushas Haaretz? You have Psukim written on the trees. Where do you have the Psukim? So he said, it was in Lampert Auditorium. He was giving the Yortzeit Shir. So he said, the Mekadosh of Eretz Yisrael the first time around was the Kibush. So he screamed out, who did the Kibush? Everybody screamed, Yeshua ben Nun's army. He said, what are you talking about? Doesn't say that. It says in Sefer Yeshua, Aron Abris. Aron Abris had the Shivei Luchas, had the Luchas, Shivei Luchas there. The Mekadosh of Eretz Yisrael the first time around was Torah, the Aron Abris. But then we assume Kedusha Rishonah was Butler. So when the Mekadosh Eretz Yisrael the second time around, so what was the Mekadosh? There was no Kibush. The second time there was no Kibush till the days of the Chashmonaim. There was no Kibush at all. So what was the Mekadosh the second time? So we don't know what the Rambam means when he says Chazaka. Rav Soloveitchik suggested, maybe it's not what the Rambam says. He suggested maybe historically, the Gemara assumes, the Gemara Masechah Shabbos has a tradition that on the occasion of Ma'ameh HaSinai, Bnei Yisrael, it says in the Chumash, Bnei Yisrael said Nasav and Ishma, but even though they said Nasav and Ishma, it was Kaf Aleim Har Kegigas. So Tosfos says, what was the need to be Kaf Aleim Har Kegigas? They said Nasav and Ishma. So Tosfos gives an answer. So the Mefarshim over there say, look in the Medrash Tanchuma. Medrash Tanchuma gives an answer. Medrash Tanchuma Parshas Noach has a long essay on this. So the Medrash Tanchuma explains, Moshe Rabbeinu said, the Rebbeinu Shalom is offering you the Torah. Do you want it? So he said, what does it say? He tells him, Shabbos Kasher is Taras HaMishpacha. He tells him what it says in Chumash. So he said, it doesn't seem so complicated. Nasav and Ishma. Then he says, well, wait a minute. There's a Torah Shebal Peh. So what's that? That's Bavli, Yerushalmi, Sefros, Ephraim, Mechilta, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, Mishnah Brura, Darkei Tshuva, Pischei Tshuva. Then they said, too much. Kosher Kishalkino, Rishafer, Rish Veyesh, Alebes Yo. Torah Shebal Peh is too complicated, and it's too complicated to learn, it's too complicated to observe it. We don't want to accept Torah Shebal Peh. We only want to accept Torah Shebichsav. So they said Nasav and Ishma on the Torah Shebichsav, but it's Kaf Aleim Har Kegigas regarding the Torah Shebal Peh. So then the Pasuk says in Megillas Esther, sounds like Kabbalah Torah. The Gemara said it was the second Kabbalah Torah. That's when they were Mekabel the Torah Shebal Peh. That goes on the Torah Shebal Peh. So Rav Soloveitchik suggested maybe the Mekadosh of Eretz Yisrael the second time was the fact that they were Mekabel Torah Shebal Peh. Just like the Mekadosh the first time was the Orim with the Luchais, the Mekadosh the first time was Torah Shebichsav. So maybe the Mekadosh the second time, because the story of Esther, according to the Gemara's tradition, the Nes Purim occurred towards the end of the 70 years of Golus Bavel, right before they came, a year or two before they came back to Shiva Sim, before they came back to Eretz Yisrael. Rav Soloveitchik suggested maybe just like the Mekadosh the first time around was Torah Shebichsav, maybe the second time around the Mekadosh was the fact that Torah Mekabel, Torah Shebal Peh. It could well be, this Rav Soloveitchik didn't say, it could well be that that's the reason why the Kedusha Rishona was Batla and the Kedusha Shneya was Lo Batla. Because Torah Shebichsav is a tangible object. If you take a Sefer Torah, you burn it, so you can destroy it. So the Kedusha that's based on Torah Shebichsav, if you say Kedusha Sa'aretz, it's based on Torah Shebichsav. Just like Torah Shebichsav lends itself to be destroyed. The Gemara has a din, Haroya Sefer Torah Shenisraf is obligated to rip two kriyas, one kriya on the klaf, on the gvil, and one kriya on the ksav. So you see from the Gemara, when you burn a Sefer Torah, you destroy both the klaf and the oisias. There's another Gemara that says in Avodah Zarah when Rabbi Shua, I think Rabbi Shua Hananya, one day Asara Haruge Malchus. So he had a Sefer Torah and he was teaching Torah in public. So the Romans took him and they wrapped him in a Sefer Torah and they burnt him alive. So the Gemara says the Talmidim were there when they saw the Rebbe being killed by the Romans. So they saw Rabbi Shua Hananya, he was looking at something, he kept on moving his face to look at something, so they didn't see anything. What is he looking at? Thin air. There's nothing there. So they asked him, Mata Raya, what are you looking at? So he says, he sees Gvil and Nisraf Ba'osyas Parchas Ba'avir. He sees the Osyas Parchas Ba'avir. So the Mefarshim ask, it's a steer between the two Gemaras. The Gemara says in Moed Katan, in the middle of Eila Megalcha, middle of the Dinim of Rip and Kriya, Sefer Torah and Nisraf, if someone burns a Sefer Torah on purpose to destroy it, you have to achas ala klaf, achas ala gvil, achas ala oisias. So see, when you destroy a Sefer Torah, you destroy the oisias. The other Gemara seems to say, when they burned Rabbi Sheba Hananya, he says, oisias parchas ba'avir, that they didn't succeed in destroying the oisias. They only burnt the klaf and the oisias weren't destroyed. So Rav Soloveitchik said, al derech hadrash, a different answer on this kasha. But al pi pashtas, maybe you can give a simple answer. When they burn a Sefer Torah is a tangible object. So of course you burn the oisias and you burn the klaf. But Rabbi Shua Hanani, he wasn't talking about, he wrapped him in a Sefer Torah. He's not talking about the oisias of the Sefer Torah. That got burned. He was giving a shir, he was teaching Torah Shabbat Peh. So he said, oisias parchas ba'avir, those are the oisias of the shir that he gave, the Torah Shabbat Peh. Torah Shabbat Peh is not a tangible object. It belongs to the world of ideas. It can't destroy an idea. The ideas are floating in the air. All ideas are floating in the air. You can only burn something that's tangible. So maybe that's the explanation why the Kedusha Rishona was Batla and the Kedusha Shneya was Lo Batla. Maybe Kedusha Rishona was based on the Aron with the Luchos. The Aron made the Kibush. So Aron with the Luchos, that's Torah Shebichsav. Torah Shebichsav is a tangible object, lends itself to destruction. So the Kedusha was destroyed. Kedusha was based on Kibush, so when the Babylonian armies undid the Kibush, so the whole Kedusha vanished into thin air. But the Kedusha Shneya was not based on Torah Shebichsav, maybe it was based on Torah Shebal Peh, so maybe that's the reason why it was everlasting. Kedusha Shneya was Lo Batla. Most of the Rishonim Pascha like that cheetah, the Kedusha Shneya Kitchel L'Shaita, they Kitchel L'Salav. The Kedusha remains even today. In Shulchan Aruch they quote the Bir Agwan, Shin Lamed Aleph. They have, in the days of Rabbi Yosef Kara, days of the Tur lived in Chutzlor, did live in there. So the Tur has all of the Mitzvah Tluis Baritz in one siman, in Shin Lamed Aleph. Today they write hundreds of Svarim on that. When the Shulchan Aruch, it's all one siman, Shin Lamed Aleph. So the Bir Agwan, Shin Lamed Aleph, quotes this from the Sefer HaTruma, from the Baal HaTaisis, Rabbeinu Baruch, Baal Sefer HaTruma, that he says that the Kedusha Shneya was also Batla. But the consensus is not so. The general accepted opinion is not like the Sefer HaTruma. We assume Kedusha Shneya was Lo Batla. So these are three different inyanim. First inyan is, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, what was on top, relevant for the issue of the international dateline. Second topic is ownership of Eretz Yisrael. The Jewish people acquired the ownership. Avraham Avinu was Kaina, and we never lost our ownership, because there was a bris and a shvua, and the Rabban Chumash writes a bris and the shvua means al kol panim. And then the third topic is the Kedusha Sar. So there was a Kedusha Rishona, Ayidei Yeshua ben Nun, then the Kedusha Shneya, and the generally accepted opinion is Kedusha Shneya is Kid Shalasi Lolav. Then there's another topic. All of Eretz Yisrael has a lower level of Kedushas HaMikdash. There is a Mishnah at the end of the first parak in Kalim, and in the Chassidish Sidurim, they have it on Leil Shabbos, on Friday night. They have that section in the Siddur. As the Kedusha is saying, there are 10 levels in Eretz Yisrael. The Mishnah says, Eretz Yisrael Mikodesh is Mikol HaRotzos. Ayoros HaMekafes Chaim and Eretz Yisrael have a higher level of Kedusha than the rest of Eretz Yisrael. Yerushalayim has a higher level of Kedusha than Ayoros HaMekafes Chaim. The Harabais has a higher level. And then with the Rabbanon, you divide Harabais into three. All of Minatorah, all of Harabais has the same status. With the Rabbanon, we divide the Harabais into 3 different levels. Then you have Ben Hulam V'Lam Mizbech, then you have the Echad, then you have the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the 10 different levels. So the Mishnah gives you there the first din. And every step of the way, the Mishnah gives you an afkamina. No such thing as Kedusha Arti Lois, abstract Kedusha. Kedusha means halacha l'maisa. You have certain dinim here that don't apply anywhere else. Otherwise, you don't call it Kedusha. So the Mishnah gives you an afkamina ledina each step of the way. So the Mishnah has a funny din. The omer is barley, has to have grown in Eretz Yisrael. And the shtei alechem that you bring on Shavuot says chitim has to have grown in Eretz Yisrael. All year long, when you bring a mincha, you can take barley or wheat that grew in Eretz Yisraal, grew in Chutz La'aretz, doesn't make a difference where it grew. Omer shtei alechem, a funny din, has to have dafka grown in Eretz Yisrael. So it's awkward. And then the 2 girses in the Mishnah, whether it does say Bikurim or doesn't say Bikurim. Why did the Mishnah write these dinim that we never heard of? The Omer, the Shtei Alechem, has to grow in Eretz Yisrael. Say, Kedusha, Eretz Yisrael, B'Kodesh, B'Kol HaRatzah, Yechayiv, and Leket, Shik Chapeh, Trumas HaMaisa, Shemitah V'Yovel, Peret Olalos. There's so many dinim. But they pick on these 2 dinim that hardly ever, no one heard of them. That the Omer, Shtei Alechem, has to grow in Eretz Yisrael. So Rav Soloveitchik once said over, and they quote, Rav Menachem Zemba has this. Menachem Zemba had a chover. Menachem Zemba was a businessman. He had a hardware store. But he was a goy adder. He knew everything. He knew Kol HaTorah Kula. He was killed by the Nazis at the end of the Warsaw Ghetto, at the end of the uprising. So he was killed in the middle. So he had there was a whole chabura of Polish goyim adirim who were businessmen. And they could shake out of their sleeves. Yerushalmis and Rogatchovs, they knew Kol HaTorah, they knew all the Samer, they knew everything. Unbelievable. So one of his chaverim, Rav Menachem Zemba's chaverim, I forgot his name, Yoskevich, he was putting out the Sifrei Zuta on Bamidbar. And he has footnotes, Mar B'Kaimas, footnotes. So he sent a copy of the galleys to Rav Menachem Zemba. Does he want to add anything? So the Sifrei Zuta begins with the same Mishnah, Esek Kedusha Zayin. It begins with Shiloch Tamei Men HaMachna, Parshas Nasai. So Menachem Zemba sent him a kuntris 100 pages long that he should add. Oitzer HaSifrei. Those were his oris on the Esek Kedushas. So Rav Menachem Zemba has this, but Rav Soloveitchik used to say every year when he had Yortzeit for his father, he said, Mishnah, he said, we'd often say this over. Rav Menachem Zemba has the same thing. The Mishnah is not telling us Eretz Yisrael has Kedushas Haaretz. That's a different thing. The Mishnah is telling us all of Eretz Yisrael has a lower level of Kedushas HaMikdash. The center of Kedushas HaMikdash is the Kodesh HaKadoshim, where you have the Orim with the Luchas. And then you have the Heichal, has a slightly lower level of Kedush. Then you have Ben Hulam V'Lam Mizbech has a slightly lower level. Then you go to the Ezra's Kohanim and Ezra's Sa'am and Ezra's Noshim. You're going down from the center of Kedusha is the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And all of Eretz Yisrael has a lower level of Kedushas HaMikdash. Not that it has Kedushas Haaretz. That's why the Mishnah didn't say Eretz Yisrael B'Kodeshes Mikol HaRatzos, that Yechayiv and Trumas HaMaisa Shemitah V'Yovel Leket Shik Chapeh. That we know. That's Kedushas Haaretz. We're trying to figure out where do you see that there's a din that all of Eretz Yisrael has a lower level of Kedushas HaMikdash. The Mishnah gives these 2 funny dinim. The omer has to really be grown in the Beis HaMikdash, but they're not going to let you plant any vegetables in the Beis. They're not going to let you plant chitim and sarim. So that's the din. All of Eretz Yisrael has a lower level of Kedushas HaMikdash. Shlomo HaMelech, when he completed the building of the Beis HaMikdash, he offered a tefillah that appears in Malachim and appears in Divrei Yavim also. So this tefillah, he doesn't say a word about karbanos. He said, I built the Beis HaMikdash, it should be a makom tefillah, Everyone should come to daven, an individual, the nation, Jews, Nochrim, whoever comes to daven to Kehillas Yisrael can come to the Beis HaMikdash and daven. And then he says, and if you're not in the Beis HaMikdash, let them face the Beis HaMikdash. And if you're outside of Yerushalayim, you should face Yerushalayim. And if you're outside of Eretz Yisrael, derech Artzam, derech Erazos. The ikar is you have to daven nochach HaMikdash. The Rambam quotes the Rambam in the beginning of Hilchas Tefillah. He quotes the Rambam's opinion is that the one is obligated to daven once a day, every day, min Torah. And when the Gemara says Tefillah is midrabanan, that means the fact that we daven 3 times a day, sometimes 4 times a day, Yom Kippur, you daven Eilu 5 times a day, that's midrabanan. But once a day, every day is deraisa. And the general outline that you have to begin with Shevach, and then have Bakosha, then you have Hoydaya, that's also min Torah. So when we say Tefillah is the Rabbanan, means the fact that you daven more than once a day, that's the Rabbanan. The fact that we have a specific nusach, word for word, that's only with the Rabbanan. But Tefillah is min Torah. Then the Rambam says, Anshim Tesak Dala came, and they instituted all the din of the Rabbanan. So when he first writes what's a din deraisa, he writes that Nochach HaMikdash is a din deraisa. Sefer HaMitzvahs also, when the Rambam lists off, when the Rambam starts off, the first mitzvah says, say we believe in God. Then it says we believe there's only one God. Then we have a mitzvah Avos Hashem, a mitzvah Yiras Hashem. Then I think either the 5th or the 6th mitzvahs that we should daven. So he puts in the Sefer HaMitzvahs in a brief, short paragraph, Nochach HaMikdash. That's part of the din deraisa. You have to daven Nochach HaMikdash. So if you have to daven Nochach HaMikdash, what do you mean if you're Chutz La'aretz, you face Eretz Yisrael? What if you're facing Eretz Yisrael, but you're not facing, why shouldn't you face the Beis HaMikdash? Apparently all of Eretz Yisrael has a lower level of Kedushas HaMikdash. So once you're facing Eretz Yisrael is sufficient. You don't have to face the Mikdash. If you're in Eretz Yisrael, then you should face Yerushalayim. Because all of Yerushalayim has a lower level of Kedushas HaMikdash. If you're in Yerushalayim, then you have to face the Beis HaMikdash. But if you're in Chutz La'aretz, you don't have to face the Beis HaMikdash. You can face any area in Eretz Yisrael, because all of Eretz Yisrael has a lower level of Kedushas HaMikdash. The Gemara has a comment on the closing pasuk in Shivas Hazino. V'chipa ad Mosai Amai. So the pasuk pshat in Shivas Hazino is, the pasuk says, the Jewish people will experience a Holocaust, that they never had anything like that. And people will be asking, where was God when all of this happened? Where was God when all of this was happening? And the Christian missionaries were trying to get all the Jews to convert. And the Nazis, when they were killing the Jews, they were saying, you still believe that you're the Am HaNivcha? Your God left you. You're not the Am HaNivcha, we're killing you. Many of the Jews responded, we are the Am HaNivcha. If we would be in your position, we would never act like you. They acted like monsters. So the pasuk says, after all of this Holocaust will be over, the Chipa ad Masai Amai, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will appease his land, and that's the pasuk pshat in the pasuk. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will appease his land, and he will appease his nation. So the Hakamas HaMedina, that's what everybody said in 1940. Hakamas HaMedina is right following that Holocaust. That's the simple pshat in Psukim. The Chipa ad Masai, HaKadosh Baruch Hu appeased his land, that the land went back to the Jewish people. The Chipa Amma, he appeased Bnei Yisrael. Bnei Yisrael got married, they had children, grandchildren, they became wealthy, the Jews are on top of the world. That's the Pashup Pshat. So the Gemara has an additional level of interpretation. The Chipa ad Masa Amo, if someone is buried in Eretz Yisrael, it's Kilu Kova Tachas HaMizbech. He gets Kova Eretz Yisrael, gets Mechillas Avainas. Mechillas Avainas has to do with bringing Karbonis and Beis HaMikdash. So the Gemara is understanding in the Pasuk that if a person walks Dalan Amis in Eretz Yisrael during his lifetime, or even to a lesser extent, if he's buried, more correct is he should live in Eretz Yisrael. Living in Eretz Yisrael is a mechaper, but even if he never lived in Eretz Yisrael, he's buried in Eretz Yisrael, the Chiper Amosam, but when he's buried in Eretz Yisrael, Kilo Kover, Taras HaMizbech, he get a kappa. So you see, the Tanoim are saying all of Eretz Yisrael has a lower level of Kedushas HaMikdash, that it's mechaper, for the living, for the dead. So that's another inyan of Eretz Yisrael. Then there's a fifth inyan of Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael as a political entity. Medinas Yisrael, not just Eretz Yisrael. There's an Inyanei Medinas Yisrael. The Ramban and the Sefer HaMitzvahs. The Rambam lists up on his opinion of the 613 mitzvahs, and the Ramban disagrees here and there. He deletes a whole bunch of mitzvahs, then he has to replace them with other mitzvahs, because the Midrashim say that 248 mitzvahs essay, 365 mitzvahs less essay. So he has mitzvah dalid, sheshachach harav. He always speaks with great respect of the Rambam, even though he disagrees so often with the Rambam. He always speaks with great respect. So he says the Rambam forgot the mitzvah of Eretz Yisrael. So the Kehillas Esther is the commentary on the side of the page. He always comes to defend the Rambam from all the hasagas of the Ramban. So the Kehillas Esther misunderstood the hasagas of Ramban. He thought the Ramban was coming to disagree about Hakamas HaMedina. The Ramban says there's a mitzvah in all the generations, if the Jewish people have the ability to put together an army and to seize hold of Eretz Yisrael, and to establish a Jewish government controlling all of Eretz Yisrael. We shouldn't leave it in the hands of the Nuch. It's not enough that you have a holy land and you're going to do mitzvahs here and you're going to be mafresh chumas and maisis and observe all the mitzvahs. No, Eretz Yisrael has to be a political entity that's governed by the Jewish people. So the Kehillas Esther misunderstood. Kehillas Esther was written by a rabbi, by a man whose mother passed away. Her name was Esther, as he was going to print. So he wanted to memorialize the mother, so he called the Kehillas Esther. So it's a good sefer, whether written by a man or a woman. It's a good sefer. So the Kehillas Esther misunderstood over here. He thought the hasagas Rabban was on the mitzvah of Hakamas HaMedina. And he explains why the Rambam didn't count it, because it's not noeg b'zman hazeh, because of the Shol Shavuos. He was the first one who took that Gemara, the end of Ksulis, about the pasuk that appears 3 times in Shir Hashirim, Mishpat Yescha, B'Davar Yerushalayim, Shol Shavuos. We're not allowed to pressure the Umas Ha'olam to let us establish a Jewish government in Eretz Yisrael. So he says, since the mitzvah is not noeg b'zman hazeh, so that's why the Rambam didn't count it. So that's a major mistake. The Inyanei Eretz Yisrael says the whole Kehillas Esther is wrong. That mitzvah the Rambam did count. The Gemara in Sadirna says, Gimel mitzvahs, Nitztav Yisrael bichnisasum la'aretz, when the Jewish people entered Eretz Yisrael, they became obligated to fulfill 3 mitzvahs in a specific order. First mitzvah is Lahamad Lahem Melech, to establish a Jewish government controlling all of Eretz Yisrael. Second is Lahachrazar, a government has to have a standing army to protect the country. Then Lahachrazar Shal Amalek, we have to, the army has to wipe out Amalek. And then when it's going to be peaceful in Eretz Yisrael, then livness lahem beis habchira. So the Rambam quotes that in the beginning of Hilchos Malachim, Gimel mitzvahs and Tztav Yisrael. There's a mitzvah to establish a Jewish government in Eretz Yisrael. And Yerushalayim al pi din is the capital, whether the American Congress agrees or doesn't agree. Yerushalayim is al pi din the capital. We have dinim that are based on the fact Yerushalayim is the Makam HaMikdash, and we have dinim that are based on the fact Yerushalayim is the capital of Eretz Yisrael. We say on Leil Shabbos, Mikdash Melech Ir Melucha. Yerushalayim is the capital, Ir Melucha, and it's Mikdash Melech. Both. Half of Yerushalayim is in Shevet Binyamin, half of Yerushalayim is Shevet Yehuda. And the Gemara says, even 1 inch of the Mizbech may not be in Chelka Shal Yehuda, because Chelka Shal Yehuda, Yerushalayim is a divided city. Not half the Arabs and half of the Jews. All for the Jews, half Binyamin and half Yehuda, because the Mizbech has to be B'Chelka Shal Binyamin, and the government has to be B'Chelka Shal Yehuda. The Marsha says on the Gemara, in a certain sense, you have to have a separation between church and state. We don't want the government to control the religion. We don't want the government to control the Rabbanut. That's one of the reasons why Rav Soloveitchik didn't want to become chief rabbi. He said it's not a chief rabbinate. The government is controlling the Rabbanut. So it's not a Rabbanut. The Gemara at the end of Sanhedrin, as the Machlokes, in the days of Yeshua ben Machlokes Abiyach and Vishlokish, days of Yeshua ben Nun, when they were dividing Eretz Yisrael the Shvatim, so they're drawing lines. Does it make sense to draw a line in such a way, but the Cholkim Erachas L'Shnei Shvatim? Does it make sense to draw a line cutting through an already existing city in such a way that half of the city will be in one shevet, half of the city will be in another shevet? So we assume that it does not make sense. One exception to the rule is Yerushalayim, because Yerushalayim, the Dafke, was a divided city. Half of Yerushalayim was B'Chelka Shal Binyamin, half was B'Chelka Shal Yehuda, because Yerushalayim has a double status. So that's Eretz Yisrael is a political entity, and Yerushalayim is a political entity as the capital of Eretz Yisrael. And we have dinim that are based on that. A lot of dinim based on the fact that that Yerushalayim is the capital of Eretz Yisrael. So that's the fifth inyan. Then there's the sixth inyan of Eretz Yisrael. We have several mitzvahs that only apply in Eretz Yisrael, which are not agricultural mitzvahs. Just yesterday we bench Rosh Chodesh. So I live in Chutz La'aretz. So the Rambam says that today, years ago when we had a bezin, so the bezin would declare Rosh Chodesh. Bizman is that, how does Rosh Chodesh come about? You don't have any bezin, nobody has any smicha. So the Rambam says the Jews in Eretz Yisrael who announced the Shabbos before when Rosh Chodesh is going to be, and then on Rosh Chodesh they say Yalav Yov, they say Hallel, whatever. They act it out. They observe it as Rosh Chodesh. The Jews in Eretz Yisrael are the ones who make it into Rosh Chodesh. So I feel fortunate every year, about every year. I'm lucky enough to be in Eretz Yisrael on a Shabbos Mevorchim. So I feel as if I'm part of the people who are creating Kedushas Rosh Chodesh. The people that live in Chutz La'aretz, they're following the Jews who live in Eretz Yisrael. So what kind of a din is that? They can only have Kiddush HaChodesh in Eretz Yisrael. You can't have Kiddush HaChodesh in Chutz La'aretz. Has nothing to do with agriculture. Why is it only in Eretz Yisrael? Gemara learns out from a pasuk. Then the Gemara has another din. You can only confer smicha in Eretz Yisrael. You can't confer smicha in Chutz La'aretz. Why is that? So the Gemara doesn't even have a pasuk there. So the Rambam in the Pirush HaMishnayos, he should have had it in Sanhedrin somewhere when the Gemara talks about smicha. The Rambam is in the Pirush HaMishnayos in Bechoros on Daf Chav Tes. When the Mishnah says Rab Tarfon gave a mistaken psak, he paskened that if you have a female behemoth and they remove the rechem from the behemoth, so it's going to be a treifa. So Rab Tarfon said they had such a behemoth, they shechted it. Tarfon said it's a treifa, so they fed it to the dogs. And then they told Rab Tarfon he's wrong. Even though the Beis HaRechem is not there, it's not a treifa. So he said, Holcha Chamorcha Tarfon, I'm going to have to pay. If the Dayan made a mistake in halacha, he's Chai Medina D'Gami. He was mafsid. He was the one who told them they should feed it to the behemoths. So he said, I'm going to have to pay. So they told Rab Tarfon, no, you have smicha, you have reshus lahora, so you're not going to pay. So the Rambam there, of all places, the Rambam on that punkt, on that Mishnah, in Bechoros, on Daf Chav Tes, the Rambam explains why smicha can only be conferred in Eretz Yisrael. So he quotes a Gemara in the beginning of Harius, that there's an institution of Parhalam Davar Shel Tzibur. It means a Chumash has a din by Yikra. If a person does an Aver B'Shogeg, he has to bring a Korban Chatas. What kind of an Aver did he do B'Shogeg? He cheated in business B'Shogeg, so it's usually B'Mezid. He spoke Lashon Hara B'Shogeg, usually B'Mezid. So what Aver did he do B'Shogeg that he has to bring a Chatas? So the Gemara has a tradition. Only such an Aver, if he would have done it B'Mezid, he would have Mechayiv Kares. The Davish has done a card, so he could go to Chatas. So then the Torah has an institution, a Parhal and Davar Shel Tzibur. What if the Bezdin HaGadol gave a psak that you're allowed to turn on lights on Shabbos? So if you're allowed to turn on lights, everybody's turning on lights. What do you need a Shabbos clock for? Is mutter turn on, turn off lights? What do you need a Shabbos clock? So then, 30 years later, all the members of the Bezdin HaGadol are changed, and now they pass on Tzosset to turn on lights on Shabbos. So now it comes out that the Roiv HaTzibur violated Chilul Shabbos based on the mistaken psak of the Bezdin HaGadol. So if the Roiv HaTzibur, that's how we pass him. If the Miut HaTzibur did the Yisr, millions of people, Miut HaTzibur did the Yisr Chilul Shabbos, even though it wasn't their fault. It's the fault of the Bezdin HaGadol. Each and every person has to bring a Chatas. But if it's the Roiv HaTzibur, then we say Bezdin HaGadol brings a Parhal and Davar Shel Tzibur, and everybody gets a kapar. So the Gemara says, how do you calculate whether Roiv HaTzibur did the Aver or only Miut HaTzibur? So the Gemara says, Aloshem B'Hoiro, when it comes to the mistaken psak of the Bezdin HaGadol, Haloch HaCharov Yoshvei Eretz Yisrael. Only the Jews who live in Eretz Yisrael count, based on the pasuk in Sefer Malachim. That the Chumash by Parhal and Davar Shel Tzibur uses the expression Ne'elam Doveh Me'eni HaKohol. The Kohol made a mistake. Who's Kohol? So the pasuk says when Shlomo HaMelech completed the building of the Beis HaMikdash, people came from all over, from the northernmost point on Eretz Yisrael to the southernmost point. Kohol Gadol Melavai Chamos Ad Nachem Mitzrayim. From the northernmost point of Eretz Yisrael to the southernmost point of Eretz Yisrael, everybody came to Yerushalayim to celebrate. So the Gemara said, you see from that pasuk that the term Kohol only applies to the people who live in Eretz Yisrael. Jews who live in Chutz La'aretz have the Kehillas Yisrael, but they're not part of the Klal Yisrael, the Ummah Yisraelis. in a secular way of expressing it, but it's halacha, not a secular. A nation has to have a national homeland. So the national homeland of the Jewish people is Eretz Yisrael. Ben Gurion didn't believe in Kehillas Yisrael, but he believed that the Jewish people is a nation. So he said, all the Jews who live in Chutz La'aretz are not Jewish. Yeah, he's right. They only have Kehillas Yisrael. He wasn't Goris Kehillas Yisrael. He knew that there's such a concept of Anuma Yisrael is a nation. So he's right. Those Jews who live in Chutz La'aretz are not part of Klal Yisrael. That's what it says. That's what it says in the Rambam. The Avnei Nezer has the Tshuvas, and the Avnei Nezer on the Orach Chaim has 2 volumes. So this is the first 2 Tshuvas, and the Chelek Sheni is in Hilchos Rosh Chodesh, where he collects a few Rambams. He has that Rambam in the Pirush HaMishnah. I don't sit and read Pirush HaMishnah. I would never have known this on my own. There's Pirush HaMishnah in B'choros on Daf Chavtes. Then he has the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah. The Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvahs there's a mitzvah to do Kiddush HaChodesh and Ibra Hashanah and Eretz Yisrael. So the Rambam says, why do you have to do it Eretz Yisrael? Because the Kiddush HaChodesh has to be done. Kiddush HaChodesh, Ibra Hashanah, the Kehillas Haluach. It's not a din that you need Bez Nagadol because it's such a difficult shayla. You need Bez Nagadol, it's representing Klal Yisrael. And Mizman said that there's no Bez Nagadol, the mitzvah goes back to Klal Yisrael. All the Jews in Eretz Yisrael are the ones that make Kiddush HaChodesh and Ibra Hashanah today. Because only the Jews who live in Eretz Yisrael are considered members of Klal Yisrael. The Jews in Chutz La'aretz are Kedushas Yisrael, but they're not part of Klal Yisrael. So the Rambam writes a striking expression in the Sefer HaMitzvahs there when he writes about Kehillas Haluach, Mitzvah Kehillas Haluach. So he writes, if one could visualize Chas v'Shalom, that's what it says in the Hebrew translation. Sefer Mitzvah was written in Arabic, so those of us who don't know Arabic, so we use the translation. So in the Rambam he says in the translation, if one can visualize that there was a Holocaust and so many Jews were killed, but there are millions of Jews living in Chutz La'aretz, but you don't have a minion of 10 Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, he says then the Rebbeinu Shalom violated his promise. He promised that Klal Yisrael will never disappear. He said if you don't have 10 Jews living in Eretz Yisrael, Klal Yisrael doesn't exist. But you have millions of Jews living in Chutz La'aretz. They have Kedush Yisrael, but that's not Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael only applies to those who live in Eretz Yisrael. There's such a Gemara in the end of the first parak in Tainus. The Gemara says, when do you say B'sein Talamat and Baruch Aleinu? When the tzibur needs it. Let's say there's an individual person, he builds houses. Let's say in the middle of the summer. I think when you use a lot of cement to build, so you have to wash it off with water. I remember there was once such a shaila in Kerem Yavna. They paved some area, and then they had to wash it off with cold water. And the day they had to wash it off was on Shabbos. If they weren't going to do it, it's going to be a hefset moment. So the Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Goldvich, had to call up Rabbanim to be mekel. The Amir Eliakim was going to be a hefset merubah then. So let's say a person is in that field, and in the middle of the summer he needs rain. So he wants to add with Saint Talamoter, he wants the rain to come in the middle of the summer. So the Gemara says if you need rain but the tzibur doesn't need it, you say with Saint Talamoter and Shmak Aleinu. You don't say in Baruch Aleinu. You only say when the tzibur needs it. So the Gemara says, what about Ir Gedolak in Nineveh? In the city Nineveh, there are tens of thousands of Jews living there, a gigantic Jewish population. Do they say the Saint Talamota when they need rain? The Gemara says no. All the Jews who live in Chutz La'aretz ki yichidim domo. They're not considered part of Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael only applies to those who live in Eretz Yisrael. That's based on that pasuk that the Gemara Hari is quoted. Kol Gadol Melvoch Hamos. So the Minchas China quotes that Gemara at the end of the first parak in Tainus to indicate that idea that only the Jews who live in Eretz Yisrael are considered a tzibur. The Jews who live in Chutz La'aretz, they have Kedushas Yisrael. That's mechayiv them in mitzvahs, but they're not considered Klal Yisrael. And he explains the Gemara, the famous Gemara in Erechin and in Megillah. The Gemara wants to know, how come we say Halal on Chanukah and we don't say Halal on Purim? Why is there a discrepancy between the two? So Gemara gives three different suggestions. The one suggestion is you only say Halal on Nes and Eretz Yisrael. You don't see halal on a Nes that occurred in Chutz La'aretz. So the Nes Purim occurred in Chutz La'aretz. Nes Chanukah occurred in Eretz Yisrael. Nes Purim occurred in Chutz La'aretz. What kind of a din is that? Why can't you say halal on a Nes Chutz La'aretz? So the Minchas China quotes the Maharsha, gives a different explanation. He thinks that this is the pshat. You only say halal on a Nes that occurred to Klal Yisrael. So the Jews that live in Chutz La'aretz are not Klal Yisrael. But the Nes Chanukah that occurred to the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, that occurred to the Klal Yisrael. So that's Mechayiv, they say halal. So that's what the Rambam seems to have. There are several dinim that depend on Eretz Yisrael because they're totally on Klal Yisrael. In Klal Yisrael, there's only the Jews who live in Eretz Yisrael. And this, the definition of Eretz Yisrael, doesn't depend on Kedushas HaAretz. If you're talking about mitzvahs hatluyas ba'aretz, leket shikha per trumas ha'maisa shmita v'yovel peret olalos and everything else, that depends on kedusha shniya. Because kedusha rishona was batla, you have to figure out which areas have kedusha shniya. Rebbe Hita Beit Shan, the Gemara says, Rebbe Paskin that Beit Shan, certain sections of Beit Shan, not the whole Beit Shan, certain sections of Beit Shan, never had a kedusha shniya, so you don't have the mitzvahs hatluyas ba'aretz. The Rama writes over here, by Smicha and by Egel Aruf, Egel Aruf only applies in Eretz Yisrael. Smicha is only in Eretz Yisrael. The Rambam says it doesn't depend on what has Kedusha Shniya. It's not a mitzvah tlibat, it's a mitzvah that depends on Klal Yisrael. Only the Jews who live in Eretz Yisrael are called Klal Yisrael. So that, whatever had a Kedusha V'Sheina, is called Klal Yisrael, it's a national homeland of the Jewish people, even though it doesn't have a Kedusha Shniya. So the dinim are not the same. It's a sixth inyan. And then there's another inyan, Yabzgulas Haaretz. There's a famous medrash that everybody quotes, that Zav Haaretz Hahi Tov, Sham Abdolach Ve'evan HaShoham, in Parshat Bereshis. So the medrash says on that pasuk, Zav Haaretz Hahi Tov, Ein Torah K'Torahs Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara has a comment, Avir Eretz Yisrael Machkim. The Gemara in the Dorm tells a story, based on the pasuk that Asat Lacha Sham Leiv Ragos V'Chil Yananayim V'Dav Nofesh, you only have a Leiv Ragos in Chutz La'aretz. In Eretz Yisrael, the Jews are Kam. In Chutz La'aretz, they have a Leiv Ragos. So that's a separate inyan. Zgulas Haaretz is separate, unrelated to Kedushas Haaretz, unrelated to the Bailas of Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara has one opinion that the Mabul never affected Eretz Yisrael. There are no walls preventing the waters going to Eretz Yisrael, but somehow the Mabul never affected Eretz Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael has a lot of skulas. I'll just close with this. I remember the first time I visited Eretz Yisrael, so I came with an awful lot of cash, thousands of dollars to give to Rab Beryl Soloveitchik and to Rab David Soloveitchik. So when I went to Rab David Soloveitchik, I didn't know which apartment, I had the address, I didn't know which apartment he lived in, so I went to the mailboxes. So when I looked at the mailbox, I realized that the Nazir lived in the same building. So I figured, let's go in to visit the Nazir also. So I was with my wife, so we visited him. So he was trying to convince me I should become a vegetarian. It says in Shulchan Aruch that those who study Kabbalah have to be vegetarians. I don't study Kabbalah. He was into Kabbalah. And they say the Vilna Gaon was a strict vegetarian, wouldn't drink milk, cheese, eggs, fish, anything malachai. He wouldn't eat except on days when you don't say Tachlim, because he studied Kabbalah. It says in Shulchan Aruch like that. Those who study Kabbalah. He was trying to convince my wife that when his daughter married Rabbi Gorin, so everything was parva. You can make imitation liver, and it tastes just like the real thing. So my wife started to make faces. So Mrs. Nazir said, don't give him a hard time. His wife is not happy about that suggestion. He can buy a book on the corner. They were selling his book at that time, some pamphlet about why it's an Indian to become a vegetarian. So then he starts asking my wife, does she study Gemara? So she says no. So he says, do you know where it says, Avir Eretz Yisrael Machkim? So I said, I don't remember where it says. He's asking my wife, does she remember where it says? I said, I don't remember. He said, he doesn't believe me. So he tells me, where does it say? It's the Gemara, the end of Bava Basra and all places. The Gemara has a din, Perik Misha Meis. If this one died first, the Yerusha goes that way. The other one died first, the Yerusha goes the other way. After the Second World War, the Nazis killed a lot of Jews. They didn't know who was killed first. They were Dinei Torah. All the dinim are explicit in the Gemara and Shulchan Aruch. Which way does Yerusha go if you're not sure who died first? So the Gemara has a din about a woman is married, and I forgot already the whole case in the Mishnah in Perek Mishameis. You don't know who died first. So it says, "Nechasim meches kasan." Whoever is muchsa keeps it. So who is the muchsa? That's the shaila. Safik mamayna lakula. The muchsa, who's the muchsa? So the Gemara says one of the Amoraim lived in Bavel, and when he lived in Bavel, he gave one pshat. Then when he moved to Eretz Yisrael, Avir Eretz Yisrael came and he gave the correct pshat. He changed it. So Pashup Pshat the Gemara, the Rishonim say, because Avir Eretz Yisrael the Gemara says, the Gemara has an expression, two Talmidei Chachamim in Bavel are as good as one in Eretz Yisrael. One Talmid Chacham in Eretz Yisrael knows how to learn as well as two in Bavel. So you see Avir Eretz Yisrael. So he says Rav Kook didn't learn like that. Surprising. He said Rav Kook didn't learn like the Rishonim. He said a different pshat. What was the pshat that he changed, the Amoira? When he lived in Bavel, he gave one pshat. When he moved to Eretz Yisrael, he said, when he lived in Bavel, he didn't realize that there's such a thing as Nachlas Binyamin, Chelka Shal Zvulun, Chelka Shal Yisachar, Chelka Shal Yehuda. We know it's in Tanakh, but we never pay attention. When he moved to Eretz Yisrael, it became more alive, and he realized there's such a concept of so when a woman dies and it's a shaila, who died first? Should the husband yarshin or should her relatives? Her relatives are the same. She's the same shevet as her relatives. Her father, her brothers, they're the same shevet as the wife, but the husband is a different shevet. So that's the one and only din where you say Avir Eretz Yisrael. Cook said it's not a general statement. The Avir Eretz Yisrael on Shabbos and Kashrus and Taras on Mishpach and Kol HaTarkul. No, only on this one din. I was very stunned. I thought Rav Kook would always say everything in favor of Eretz Yisrael. He didn't. He said it. Oops, I don't know if it's printed anywhere. That's what the Nazir told me. These are 7 different inyanim. Because I get Eretz Yisrael. People sometimes confuse issues. They shouldn't be confused. There's Kedushas Haaretz, there's Mamonis. Eretz Yisrael always belonged to the Jewish people. Eretz Yisrael is the center of the upper hemisphere that's relevant for the rational dateline. There is Skulas Haaretz, there's Kedushas HaMikdash, all different in Yonah, but not to be confused with each other. You people are Zoicha, you live in Eretz Yisrael. Someday I hope I'll also be Zoicha. Thank you.